Good evening, everyone. We will dive into some of the questions that were common questions last time round and that have also come in, to our customer service centre, etc., in the last couple of weeks, specifically to the 22-23 forms. One of the things to point out is that if you are a type 2 GP who has a salaried role at, say, 2 different practices, then for each of the months, you would see a monthly salary entry for your different practices that you work at, and there is a practice filter to allow you to isolate and look individually at a particular practice if you need to do that, but you can, in sort of 2 clicks really, download the full data that makes up your complete contribution statement for the year and download that and save it as a CSV or a PDF if you prefer. So there's a few of the questions that we had last time that were a bit more related to this part of the process, I guess, so before you even get as far as trying to complete the Type 2 form. One thing that came up a few times was I'm not able to select 22-23 in the drop down, so go to the employee contribution statement button and there's no options there, or there's no 22-23 option there, and that's an alarm bell that there's something wrong there. So there's a number of reasons that might happen. The key one really is if your practice hasn't yet completed the pensions joiner form to commence the pension contributions for you from that practice. So if you started at the practice during 22-23, maybe it was the 1st of April, maybe it was later in the year, at that point there would be 2 things that need to happen. One is that as a GP yourself, then you need to log into PCSE Online and go to that performer list button that you see on the main screen, and it's there that you complete an employment change form to record the date that you're starting at the particular practice. So that's the first step. As you're a type 2 GP, so you're salaried, so the practice need to confirm that employment is in effect or effective from the particular date. So when you have completed the performer list employment change, then someone at the practice who has that user right or user access role for PCSE Online needs to then log in and approve or confirm that you did indeed join the practice on that date. And when they've done that, either they themselves, or it may be that in the practice they divide the roles up differently, but a user in the practice who has the pensions access, the role that allows them to submit pensions, estimates, joiners and leavers forms, etc., that person at the practice, probably the practice manager, needs to log in and enter the details to advise your estimated income for the year and the tier rates for the year when you started the employment. So if you don't see the 22-23 option on your employee contribution statement and for that particular practice, then the first thing you need to do is go to your own performer list record in PCSE Online, check that you have completed that employment change and that it's showing as approved. If it's showing as pending, that means that the practice haven't completed that approval step. So that's the first thing. If that all looks fine and it's showing as approved, then speak to the practice manager, because they either haven't started or haven't fully completed the pensions joiner process on PCSE Online to actually initiate contributions for you. Now, when they do that, so when they complete that pensions joiner form, and even if you started on the 1st of April 22, that will automatically initiate the contributions backdated to that starting date. So when they've completed that, and in the next monthly payment cycle, that will then be deducted from the practice to kind of catch up with the arrears really that have accumulated since you joined. That kind of straightens things with the practice, and then at that point you'll be able to log into your PCSE Online employee contribution statement and see all of those monthly contributions that are now showing against your PCSE Online record, and then you'll be able to go to the Type 2 screen and find that you can complete the Type 2 form. So appreciate that's quite a lot of detail, but there are quite a few people who, for one reason or another, find themselves in this scenario, and it's a little bit difficult to understand how to unpick it. And like I say, you need to kind of go back to the beginning, look at your own performer record, make sure that you did submit the employment change to say, you know, I started on the 1st of June or whatever it was that occurred. And even if it was in the 21-22 year, it might be that it's, you know, it's so far behind if that hasn't been completed yet. So if you've completed it, if the practice haven't approved it, you need to speak to the practice about that. If the practice have approved that and your employment change shows as approved in PCSE Online, the next thing to do is to check with the practice manager about the completion of the pensions joiner form, because that's where they need to enter your estimated income and tier rate for that year, which will initiate the backdated contributions. When that's all done, then you're able to submit your end of year form. So I hope that does clear up some of that. This is a slightly different question, I think. Anyway, it's always difficult to be fully versed in what the scenario that people are putting down when they put questions in a Teams chat. My employee contribution statement is blank despite paying pension for a number of years. How can this be fixed? So I suspect for this instance that this GP has more than one login to PCSE Online for whatever reason. Someone in the past has set them up with a login, potentially with particular purpose to view statements or something like that for the practice, but that's not linked to the performer and pension record. So if you find yourself, and it is a rare scenario, but again, we've sort of included it because it was mentioned last time, the way to check that is if you haven't got your performer list button attached to that record, or even if you have and you still don't have your pension contributions, then you do need to contact us too, so that we can investigate why that is. But the most likely reason is that you've got more than one PCSE Online account, and the pension contributions would be showing if you had that different login. So we can help you work that out. This is a common one, actually. A few people might see this. If you log into your employee contribution statement and there's a negative number showing against November 22, there's a separate line showing a relatively small minus number probably, and that has occurred because of the timing of when the tier rate change was actually applied in PCSE Online. So if the contributions had already been taken for October, so the tier rates changed from the 1st of October, but if the contributions had already been taken from the practice for October by the time the tier rate change was implemented in the system, then the contributions would have been deducted at the old rates. So let's just take someone who was on that highest tier rate. So they were on 14.5% April to September. If that rolled into October, then the November minus amount is that correction, because from the 1st of October, the tier rate for that, let's say it was 130,000, would have been 13.5 and not 14.5%, just because of the way that changed. So that's nothing for you to worry about. That's a perfectly expected line in your contribution statement, and the bottom line for the 6 months period is all that matters. We've also had a few questions that are a bit similar to this one about people who've worked for an out-of-hours provider and they don't see any record at all of anything in terms of the contributions. So they're logging into PCSE Online, they're looking at an employee contribution statement, selecting 22-23, but they're not seeing any of their out-of-hours work there. They were expecting to see it as solo. The most common reason for that is because the type of employer, it may be that it's been pensioned as an officer role. So the first thing you need to do there is go to your employer and check whether or not that is being pensioned through the officer route. And if you're still not sure, if the employer is also not sure, then NHS pensions can also help with that. A couple of things to point out, I suppose, that if someone again has more than one practice that they have a salaried post at, then you'll have essentially a row 2, and then there'll be a row 2.1, and if there's 3 practices, there'll be row 2.2. And each of those practices, when you key your details into PCSE Online, then the figures for each of the practices will pull through, and you'll recognise all of that from your employee contribution statement that you've already looked at. Let's go to some of the other questions then that we had last time in relation to the Type 2 forms themselves. So we had quite a number on the kind of theme of, I know I've started a form, or I'm not even conscious that I've started the form. Essentially, when I've been trying to go to the Type 2 screen then, and I'm trying to select my 22-23 year, then it's coming up as already started, completed. So it's not letting me do anything. When anything is in the system and it's already been started the process, whether it's fully completed and you fully submitted it or it's currently in draft, then you go to that same listing screen, and if you click search, you will then see your form, and you'll be able to just click on the hyperlink of the form if it's showing in draft status and continue where you left off. And that a draft form is created. You don't have to do very much really on the Type 2 screen for the system to create a draft just with your personal details in it. So, you know, if you go to select 22-23 and it says already completed, then if you go to the listing screen, you should then see a draft. You click on the hyperlink for that form that is in draft status, and you can go back to the very beginning and you know, make any corrections or amendments and fully complete your form. So some people had flagged that they get an error when they try to just click on the Type 2 button. They don't get very far, and that tends to come around. It's a fairly similar root cause really as the one that we talked in quite a lot of detail about earlier, where on the employee contribution statement, the GP couldn't see any contributions for 22-23. If the system isn't aware that you've had Type 2 status or Type 2 contributions in the year, then it won't allow you to proceed with the Type 2 form. So the answer to that and the what do I need to do about it goes back into that detail of checking that your employment change that you submitted on the performer list side has been approved, and making sure the practice complete that joiner form, and then you can get back to submitting your Type 2 form. A few people got a bit confused because their PCSE Online 22-23 form only shows them either the October to March tab or indeed the April to September tab. So you remember from the video, you kind of have the sections down the left-hand side, whereas the Excel version of the form has the tabs along the bottom. The Excel version of the form has all the tabs, but if you're completing your form on PCSE Online and you didn't start a particular role that made you a Type 2 GP until October, or indeed, you know, November or January in that 22-23 year, then you'll only see the October to March tab for completion. If you've worked across the two periods, then you'll see both tabs. This unable to select 22-23 in the drop down. This time it's more in relation to the certificate screen, or the self-assessment screen anyway, rather than the employee contribution statement. But again, similar issues in terms of what causes that. Then there's something in those early processes that I've talked quite a lot about that needs to be rectified, and then you'll be able to select the 22-23. Quite a bit of confusion, I think, when people have done a fair bit of locum work along with maybe Type 2 practice salaried role and or solo work. The locum practices don't get recorded individually. If you look at the Excel version of the form, then it now asks for you to select your practice work and enter the practice ODS code. It asks you to select if you've done solo work and enter the ODS code of the provider. But for locum contributions, although you record them in that Type 2 form, you don't list out all the practices separately. Okay, so a couple of other themes that we've kind of got in terms of not being able to complete the Type 2. So this just brings to life some of those questions, I think, that we've kind of listed off already. But you can see on the screen here that when our GP has logged in, again, test account, and went to select the financial year, and this is the Type 2 screen, so they've gone into the GP pension section, they've selected self-assessment, and they've went to select the Type 2 self-assessment form. They've gone in, it's populated with their details, but when they've gone to the financial year, it says it's already initiated or completed. And this is the bit where we need to then go and find this draft form. So as I said, quite a lot of questions about that the last time, but we go to the listing screen, you do that search and you click on the form itself. So you've got a hyperlink, the blue text, blue figures, etc. That's a hyperlink to the form that has been started, and you just carry on completing the form from there. If for any reason you want to start absolutely from scratch, then you can scroll to the right when you've got a draft form. You can scroll to the right and you can click delete. Okay. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of particular issues around the subject of reconciliation of the contributions themselves, and I suppose especially in relation to over or under payment. So we've already touched upon, you know, our GP might easily have 3 different types of income that they need to record on the type 2 form, and the reconciliation is a little bit different for each of those, really. So if we're talking about monthly salary from just the practice, then if when this form has been processed and the reconciliation is completed, it's identified that the employee or the employer contributions have been overpaid, then the practice will receive a refund in the next contractual statement once we've processed that end of year form. And equally, if the contributions for employee or employers have been underpaid, you know, maybe the tier rate initially was lower than anticipated, etc., then the practice will have an adjustment in the next statement that will be a deduction to make that underpayment up. Now, completely understand that as a GP yourself, then you'll have your pay slips and your P60 information, and you'll be looking at that to reconcile now with what is actually due for the whole year. But the practice receives directly the refund for an overpayment. Any underpayment is collected directly from them based on the actual pensionable income that you've then earned compared to what they had put on the estimate form. So the practice will see those adjustments in their statements, and you know that calculation obviously also takes into account what the correct tier rates turned out to be for those 2 periods. So monthly salary, from a PCSE point of view, that reconciliation is done directly with the practice. Where you've done some solo work, then again, and this is all in line with the NHS pensions rules. So these aren't things that PCSE make up as our own processes. These are the processes that we need to follow. So if the GP's done solo work and it turns out that there's been an overpayment of contributions, PCSE needs to process a refund direct to the provider. As the GP, then you will do your own reconciliation with that provider to figure out whether they actually owe you any contributions back or vice versa. And then if there turns out that there's an underpayment of solo contributions, then again PCSE will contact the provider direct. That provider is requested to make the payment, and of course, unfortunately, until we do have that full reconciliation completed and any shortfall payments have been made and processed, the type 2 form can't be finalised. So that, you know, we do correspond a lot with solo providers so that might be an out of hours provider, but of course it could be you might work as a clinical leader board member for an ICB, etc. So there's also reconciliation needs to go on there for them to confirm back to PCSE as well. And then finally there's the locum income. So anybody who does locum work will be very aware that if you choose to pension that, then you submit your A and B forms throughout the year and you submit your payments, and that all needs to be done within the 10-week rule now. So at the end of the year, you would expect that everything is fairly up to date. But when it comes to this end of year process, but it might be that your tier rate again turned out to be different to what you had thought in terms of when you know what your final income and earnings for the year for all your different roles has turned out to be. So if the outcome is that you've overpaid on locum contributions, then in this instance we are allowed to refund direct to yourself. So any overpayment for employee contributions on locum work would be paid direct to the GP. And if it turns out that you should have been paying at a higher tier rate, then so therefore there's a shortfall, we will contact you to request that shortfall payment. And again, until all these locum reconciliations are done, we can't finalise the Type 2 form and can't update your NHS pensions record. Just a quick word about closed practices. Some people find themselves in a situation where, by the time we get to the reconciliation of the 22-23 form, the practice that they worked in may now have, we say closed, but that might be that, there's been a change of contract and that provider's no longer in situ. So if the employee or employer contributions have been under or overpaid, then we need to go through a process to seek guidance on how that's to be reconciled. So that, at this moment in time, is something that takes a bit of time, but we will contact you directly to let you know that that's ongoing. So that won't affect many people, but if it does, then we will let you know. Out of hours providers, similar thing, to be honest. There are a couple of out of hours providers who were under contract in 22-23 who no longer are, and for any GPs who did work for those providers during that year, then again PCSE need to liaise with NHS England / NHS Pensions on a case-by-case basis. Okay, so just to mention, if you are a locum GP or have done locum work in the year and you find yourself in that shortfall position, then there is a template. If you look at the Type 2 guide that we'll send you the link to, there's also a link through to a shortfall template and the instructions on how to complete that and how to make your shortfall payments. So just to speed that process up, as so that you're not waiting any longer than necessary to get your end of year form fully reconciled. Just some other questions that came up from the previous webinars. So this one's a bit more at the very end of the process. So, and we probably haven't touched on that at all this evening yet. So the whole objective of getting these Type 2 forms submitted and then fully reconciled is for PCSE to be able to update your NHS pensions record, so pensions online. This question is about someone who's completed the Type 2. It was all processed fine last year, but they've gone to the NHS pensions app and those contributions, there's no contributions there for 21-22. The reason that occurs is because the NHS pension system needs to be updated sequentially, and that's just a system restriction. So if our GP had a gap, maybe it was 2019-20, maybe it was 2021, and maybe they did submit the certificate, but there was a question over the reconciliation and it was unresolved, or maybe there was something at their end and they hadn't got around to it that year. But for whatever reason, if the NHS pensions record couldn't be updated in a particular year, so let's just say it was 2019-20, then even although the certificates or self-assessments submitted for the years after that, so if that was 19-20, so it might have had 20-21, 21-22, absolutely fine, no problems with them. And if that GP goes to PCSE online, they will see their self-assessments Type 2 forms approved for that 2021 and 21-22 year. But because 2019-20 is missing, then that's a gap in the record, and the NHS pension system doesn't allow anyone, PCSE or anyone else, to update it if there is a gap. So we need to get that 2019 form in or back in again if there was an issue with it in the past, get that processed, resolve that gap, and then we would be able to, in sequential order, update the other years in the GP's record, and then including now adding on hopefully the 22-23. So hopefully that explains the importance of getting those historic certificates in and resolved. This is a bit more back to PCSE online, what I'm trying to do when I'm completing the form. So this person's got 3 employers. I've had people mention all sorts of numbers, and there is, when they're trying to add a practice, then it's not, the system's not allowing them to do that. And mostly that will be down to, I guess, 2 things. One will be back to that thing again, it's the root of a lot of these issues really, where that employment change when in the PCSE online performer record either hasn't been completed, or if that has been completed and approved, the practice hasn't completed the pensions joiner element of the notifications through PCSE Online. That's again the main reason for this. It could also be that you've got the wrong code, so just check with the practice that you're using that you're trying to find the correct code. But actually, if we've already got your contributions on your employee contribution statement for this third practice, you'll be able to see the correct ODS code when you go to the little practice drop down on that employee contribution statement screen. So that should be very straightforward to resolve if that is the issue. Okay, back to I'm trying to complete the type 2 form, but when I'm looking at the drop down of the financial years, I'm seeing that some of these years are listed in red, despite the fact that if I go to the listing screen, I can see that the forms are approved. So this is when the person mentions it here, actually, they've submitted the forms using they've said the old method. What they mean by that is by using the Excel forms from the NHS Pensions website, coming in through the Contact Us form. They've been told sort of year after year, yep, that's been processed, it's fine, you're up to date. And they're going in and looking now to try and use PCSE Online for 22-23. And they're suddenly panicking, thinking, wait a minute, what's all this red? Why have I got these that look like they're selectable? And it's only a system thing about, because the form didn't get submitted directly through PCSE Online, technically it's still selectable. But if you go to that listing screen, as we've mentioned a few times, you'll see the record then of all of the certificates that have an approved status. And you can sort it in financial year order. So that's the thing. Don't worry at all about what you see in that financial year drop down for the type 2 form screen. Go to the listing screen and check we've got an approved status for the forms that you are expecting us to have. Now, this might seem like a very rudimentary question to some people, and at first it did to us too. I think I know where it comes from. So where do I get the pensionable pay figure that I need for the form? The short answer is your P60, because that's your pensionable pay for the year. But I think the question comes from the fact that when you go to do your type 2 on PCSE Online, it auto-populates with the pensionable pay figure from the practice estimate. So say the practice estimate was 50,000 and you ended up, your actual pensionable pay was 56,000, as an example. You'll see that when you go to the type 2 screen, it will auto-populate with the pensionable pay as being 50,000 because it pulls through from the system. So the first thing, what you're doing there, and actually you've got that 6-month split, haven't you? So you'll have it auto-populating with whatever the 6-month split, let's just say it's 25 and 25. What you then need to do is overwrite that with the actual pensionable pay. So you're declaring, I actually earned a pensionable pay for this role of 27,000 and then 26,500, whatever that is. So I think that's why we get so many questions about that. It's not PCSE Online isn't saying that is your pensionable pay. What PCSE Online is saying is that's the pensionable pay that was estimated for you. And the whole purpose of this type 2 process, or part of the purpose anyway, is for you to then say, well, I actually earned this amount, and then the contributions are calculated, aren't they, based on the amount you actually earned. So hopefully that kind of clears that up. And then we've had, and last time we got quite a number of questions about how do I calculate the tier rate and contributions if I have been on maternity leave. So there is an approved leave tab on the Excel version of the form and on PCSE Online. I think in the example that we showed in the video, then that GP had no approved leave, so we said we wouldn't tick that on the personal details screen in the first tab. But if you tick approved leave on that first tab, then that will make that page visible to you and you'll be able to complete the details there. There is guidance on the NHS Pensions website. We will circulate that around how the contributions are calculated when you have had a period of approved leave. But in short, your tier rate remains at the tier rate that you had when you went on approved leave, or what would apply this time to the 2 6-month periods had you been on that income. Those tier rates are then applied to the pay that you actually did earn. but your employer contributions, they're paid on what your full pay would be for that period if you weren't on approved leave. But that guidance is on the NHS Pensions website, so we're just going to see if we can circulate something round to flag that, because we have had a lot of questions on the previous webinar in relation to that.
There's an awful lot of questions regarding the difference between what is recorded on a payslip and what the individual GP can see on the employee contribution statement, and what should they put on the type 2 form to ensure that it is processed by PCSE and not rejected.
Thanks, Janet. It is worth going back to that then. If you take a sort of step back from all this, the type 2 form probably has two objectives really, or two reasons for being. As we sort of said in the video, PCSE has a requirement to determine whether the practice has paid the required amount of contributions, based on what the GP has actually earned for that year for the practice work. And that's why when you go to PCSE online, what you'll see pulling through in terms of the contributions already paid column are the contributions that have been deducted from the practice throughout that year for the full 12 months, and then the calculation in terms of the difference column is then done to say, well, actually the contributions have been deducted on an estimated income of 50,000, so therefore the contributions already paid figure is, whatever that amount is. But when you've completed your actual earnings for that practice, then the tier rate is selected, or the tier rates for 22-23, then the system will calculate what does the practice owe, or what does the practice need to be refunded to balance those contributions. And that's, as I say, the whole objective of that part of it is to make sure that the correct contributions have been paid over for you to NHS pensions from the practice for that practice role. Alongside that, though, we're very conscious of the fact that the form is called a self-assessment form, and traditionally a lot of GPs have used it to record the figures from their pay slips in terms of, or from the P60, to say this is what it says I've had deducted as pension contributions, and then to kind of sit down with the practice and say, well, I've worked out that you've deducted from me, £10,000. I actually should have been on a different tier rate and I should have paid £12,000. So, you need to make this correction for me, or equally it could be the other way around, what the practice has deducted through payroll month on month, as shown on my P60, that could end up being too much for what I've actually earned. So that kind of dual purpose of the form, when you're completing your form on PCSE online, what we recommend is that you follow the PCSE online process as set out in that type 2 guide, and you've got your figures there pulling through from in the system to help you with that, and that will calculate the practice adjustment that's required. If you do complete your form as an Excel version and you use in that column that says contributions already paid, you don't refer to your PCSE online contribution statement and you use the figures from your P60 or your payslips, then PCSE will still endeavour to process that. So we will refer back to our own system ourselves, and we will use the pensionable pay that you've declared. So back to our example where the estimate was 50,000, but the GP earned 56,000. We will use the 56,000 to say this is what the GP is declaring they actually earned for this practice, but we'll pull through the figures from PCSE online that we know have already been deducted from the practice to do that reconciliation with the practice, and you will still, of course, have to do your own personal reconciliation with the practice themselves. That does all sound, a bit overly complicated, and it kind of is, isn't it? Because the form is trying to sort of do two things. Everybody recognises that now, and Janet and myself and other colleagues have been working with NHS Pensions to kind of unpick that. It wasn't possible in time for this year's sort of window opening for these forms to have a defined kind of variation to the process, I suppose, to try and make it easier for all of you. But we're all very committed to continuing to work on that. So we're hopeful that next year there'll be something that does kind of deal with both of those things for you. But as I say, the objective from a PCSE point of view, or the requirement for us, is to make sure that those calculations are kind of correct in terms of the practice reconciliation, so that the right amount of pension contributions is paid over to NHS pensions. In addition to that, for your type 2 form, if you do any solo work or you have any locum work, as I kind of went through in probably a fair bit of detail, how that reconciliation works, we work with you if it's locum, or we work with the solo provider if it's solo, to make sure that that reconciliation for those particular contribution types is done, and then your type 2 form can be processed successfully, your pension record can be updated. But I think it's the practice employments that kind of have caused the questions, really. You know, someone said my employer statement is different to my actual pay, you know, which figure do I use? And it goes back to that point that your actual pay is the amount that you actually earned, you know, so the pensionable pay is the amount that you actually earned. That, if you're using PCSE online or if you're using the Excel form, is what you need to enter as the actual pay. The contributions already paid figures, as I say, in PCSE online, will pull through as what's been deducted from the practice, not the contributions that you've got on your pay slips. Very, very rarely are they identical in our experience.
So there's a few questions in the chat as to the tier change. Essentially, there was a tier change for the first time mid-year, and this is the result of why there needs to be 2 6-month parts to working out your pay. As discussed in the webinar, there is an annualisation calculator available on the NHS BSA website, which you can use to work out what your tier should be for each 6-month period. You can then use that either on the online form via portal or the spreadsheet via the NHS Pensions to complete the type 2 form. And essentially, you will then be able to work out the pay and the contribution tiers which are relevant to each 6-month period. There's a question about pensionable pay. So essentially, your entire pay should be pensionable unless you're a locum, where there is a 10% deduction and then 90% is pensionable.
There's a couple, someone who has CCT'd in November 23. Am I right in thinking I don't have to fill anything in this year? You're absolutely right. So your 23-24 forms would be due to be released towards the back end of 2024. And that's the year that you would complete your first end of year form type 2 for. There's another question though from someone who's retired in February 23, looking at how they can check the contributions because they no longer have the PCSE login, which is the performer list login primarily, and then it also then gives you access to your pension records. So that is something that we're looking at with the performer list team, because we fully appreciate that people need to be able to retain access to their PCSE online pension records, or contribution statements at least, you know, all of that information we said about the listing screen well into, you know, past retirement calculation, because when someone retires, if they've retired in a particular year, we've just said there about the person who's CCT, that in-year form isn't available yet, is it, to complete? You know, we don't have a 23-24 form to complete yet. So someone who retires right now, the employment is updated on estimated figures for that year that the person retired, and then when the end of year form does come out, then they do need to submit that, and NHS Pensions make their own adjustments where necessary. So we fully appreciate that you need to be able to continue to access that. So it is something that we're looking at. Someone, I think it was when we were looking at the employee contribution statement and thinking about if I've got work that I do for an ICB or NHS England as an appraiser, so if that's solo work, you know, can I filter on that? And then the answer to that is yes. You know, if you select solo as the income type, then although it says practices, it really means organisations. So you'll be able to see if you've done appraisal work in 22-23, that should be against an NHS England region. If you've worked for an ICB as a clinical lead, then that should be against your particular ICB.
I just wanted to pick up a few questions in relation to practitioner and officer. So as a GP, you may be a practitioner and an officer. Predominantly salaried roles out of hours tend to be practitioner, but some may be officer. In relation to the type 2 form, it is only your practitioner pay that goes on there. Your officer pay will be via a payslip or other mechanism, and that will go directly to NHS pensions. They will be consolidated at some point on your record, but PCSE would not be responsible for your practitioner pay. If you're not sure, the best thing to do first of all is ask your provider or who you work for, and they may be able to advise. For example, if you were to work in A&E, there are some providers that do that as a practitioner, but some do that as an officer. And you need to make sure that you're only putting your practitioner pay on the type 2 form.
I think there's a couple on a similar theme. I think I've talked a lot about joining a practice tonight. I haven't really talked at all about leaving a practice, I don't think. Just to clarify on that, people can get the same kind of problem where they don't, it might suggest that they do need a type 2 form whenever they left the practice, before the start of that pension year. They may have switched from salary to principal to partner in that year. I think there's a couple of questions, and somebody's asking about delays in processing leaver forms. There isn't a PCSE delay if there isn't any delay at all if the practice completes that pensions leaver on PCSE Online. So when they log into PCSE Online and select the pensions leaver button, the particular GP who is leaving or has left, all of the GPs in the practice will be selectable. So they select the person by name and SD number and just confirm the date that they left. That will stop the contributions, and it will also backdate a refund of any contributions that have been taken. So let's say we process a leaver form today on the 12th of March, but the GP actually left on the 1st of October. Then the practice will, in the next, if once the practice have submitted that, then in the next contractual statement, they'll get the refund for those essentially overpaid contributions, and the GP will see the adjustment on their employee contribution statement. If you're seeing anything like that for 22-23, where you've got months past the point where you stopped working at a practice, then it's kind of looping back round with the practice manager to make sure they know that they can immediately rectify that on PCSE Online. There was an old-fashioned route of submitting something in through the Contact Us form and then someone coming back for extra details and information. All of that, where possible, we've tried to build into the systems things that will instantly do the kind of auto corrections that are needed. So hopefully that helps with that one.
I just wanted to come in. There's a few questions about previous years. Katrina's touched upon this. Your record is updated sequentially. So, for example, if your 2016-17 certificate were missing, but every certificate since then is present, then your record won't be updated until that 2016-17 is populated. There's a couple of questions about where you can get previous forms. Previous forms are available either on the PCSE portal or on the NHS Pensions website. The actual requirement to fill in the type 2 form began in 2009, 2010, so it's been a long way back. If you're unsure which ones are updated, you can obviously check the PCSE portal, as Katrina mentioned, but also you can write to NHS Pensions and ask them for an update of your record. You can then look at see what years are missing, and it may be that those years, those type 2 forms need to be filled. You may put in a question to PCSE to find out that missing year, and then it may need to be resubmitted. And by doing that, you can hopefully have your record updated. But it is really important to note that it is sequential in terms of type 2 forms.
I think one of the other themes of the questions is about some people having difficulty logging into PCSE Online, or maybe having never had logged into PCSE Online. So everybody who's on the performer list, so all type 2 GPs will be, has a PCSE Online account. There's a very, very small number of people that we don't have email addresses for, but when PCSE Online first went live for performer list, then, as I say, logins were set up for all GPs at that point. And if you don't have any recollection of receiving a verification link to tell you that you've got a PCSE Online account, and then where to click to set a password and all of that, then We'll send out the instructions in the follow-up in terms of how to contact us to get a link resent to you, and our user registration team will pick those up as promptly as possible. So we'll send that round so that you know exactly who to contact. Once you've got that sorted, when you log in, you'll see that all of your contributions, you know, if you've had them deducted from a practice, etc., or if you've submitted locum A and B forms, you'll see all of that in the system, but you obviously need that login. You need to know what your credentials are, and you need the login to be working to allow you to do that.
There's a question about the annualising calculator on the NHS pensions, and it's not working. So for some individuals, when you download it, Windows can disable the macros. So what you do is download the file, right click on it, go into properties and enable macros. And once you've done that, the annualising calculator will work, and you can add each row. So for example, if you work for an out of hours provider for the whole 12 months from the 1st of April to the 31st of March, you would do one row 1st of April to the 30th of September, and then the next row from the 1st of October to the 31st of March. And you would do that for each of your type 2 roles. And in doing so, you then press calculate, and it will populate the tiers for you. But it's really important that for some individuals that macro is disabled, and that's just Windows protecting because it's a spreadsheet from an external source.
There's some people asking about, do you just pay, you know, the tier rates on the salary brackets? You know, so if you've got 50,000, you pay the first tier on the first. Is it a bit like income tax? It's not. You know, so your tier rate applies to the total pay, or in this 22-23 year, the 2-tier rates apply to first 6 months, and second 6 months you don't, you know, pay different amounts on proportions of your salary other than this 6 monthly split.
Just quickly, the annualising calculator is on the NHS Pensions website. So you go to the NHS Pensions part, practitioner, and then under there it will be the annualising calculator. It's not on the PCSE website. So there's another one on ABC box. Yes, your added years go in the ABC box. That is correct.
There's a couple of questions regarding being able just to view going back to 14-15. If you'd just like to obviously explain about PCSE Online and Go Live.
As Janet says, we had the kind of migration from the old NHS system to the PCSE system. That was in June 2021. So at that point, all of the contributions data going back to kind of the 14-15 year, any certificates that had already been processed, but contributions data in any case were migrated over. So all of your NHS pensions records that have been updated prior to that, then Christian's already mentioned the NHS Pensions or My Pensions app, and any kind of queries about, you know, historic records. If you're unsure, then again, you can get clarity from NHS Pensions.
And it was just to make it clear that it was only at the point of PCSE going live with their transform solution that we've been able to provide visibility of the historic view of the GP's records. Yeah.
Thank you. So you've got those contributions on the employee contribution statement, and then from that year onwards, and then you're able to submit your type 2 forms from that year onwards as well on the system. If you have got a gap from a really old year, then Christian's already pointed out that all of the forms going back to the year dot really are available on the NHS Pensions website as well. And if you need to use one of those really old forms because you've got a really old gap, then you would submit that to PCSE using our Contact Us form on our website. So again, lots of questions about calculating the tier rate, isn't there? Christian's already mentioned the annualising calculator and the guidance that goes there. The guidance has some examples, again, on the NHS Pensions website. We also have on our website a video that we recorded for the last type 2 and type 1 webinars that our NHS Pensions colleagues recorded on kind of some of the basics around the pension rules, etc., for type 2 and type 1 GPs. And there are some annualising examples covered in there too.
A few questions about the tier rate. We appreciate that the tier rate changing mid-year was not ideal, Next year, the tier rate will change on the 1st of April, so we won't have this situation again. But just going back to the calculator, rather than trying to work out yourself what the pay should be, if you use the analysing calculator, just by providing your dates, so the 1st of April to the 30th of September, and then the 1st of October to the 31st of March, and by putting in the relevant income in those periods, it will calculate everything for you. And once you've done that, you can use those numbers to then populate either the NHS pensions form or the PCSE portal form to submit your type 2 form. So you don't actually have to do the calculation yourself. You're essentially putting that data into the NHS pensions calculator and allowing it to do it for you. It's just ensuring that your dates are correct. And then you can do that for each of your type 2 roles. So for example, if you were a salary GP and you did out of hours, you'd put your salary GP role, and I'm assuming you're working for the whole 12 months. So from the 1st of April to the 30th of September, and then from the 1st of October to the 31st of March, you do the same for your out of hours, hit calculate, and it will do all the number crunching for you, and it will tell you what your tiers should be. You then go to the portal or the form and fill it in accordingly. If the numbers are different, you will, as Katrina mentioned earlier, you will need to adjust those numbers to what your pay and your contributions are, and therefore it will work out an overpayment, underpayment. And Katrina did a slide earlier about, depending on what type of GP you are, so salaried, out of hours, etc., how those refunds will be processed. But in a nutshell, that's the easiest way to actually work through and work out and ensure you're paying the right tier, the right pay.
I think there's a couple of questions as well about the timetable of things. So people saying whether they've submitted on PCSE online or whether they've submitted through using the Excel form and then sent it in the contact us route. So they may have already done it on for 22-23 and they just wanted to join tonight to check if they had done it correctly or just increase their knowledge, I guess. So the timetable, the forms, PCSE will work through them as quickly as possible that have been submitted. There's about 35,000 or so GPs who need to complete a type 1 and or a type 2 form for the 22-23 year. So there's a lot to get through. Don't panic if you don't hear from us in the next couple of weeks. You will receive a communication from PCSE when your form has been processed, and that will either confirm that it's been fully reconciled and everything is fine, or that there is something else that needs to be looked at. So just watch this space for that update. You should have received a case reference if you used the contact us form, just to tell you that the case is allocated. But as I say, because of the multiples of thousands of cases that there are, then it does take some time to work through that. I know you've covered it, Christian. There's an awful lot of questions from people who've got, I guess, a portfolio of different roles, some of which are practitioner and some of which are not.
So My Pensions Portal will help you determine what pensionable pay has come across. But in terms of what type of GP you are, essentially a type 2 GP is someone who may be salaried, someone who works for an out-of-hours provider, or is a long-term locum at a practice where the practice is doing the pension forms for you. A type 1 GP is those that are a partner, and a locum is solely someone who's doing work via a locum A and B form. There's quite a few questions about what you put on the type 2 form. It is only pay that is pensioned via the practitioner scheme. Any other pay that's either not pensioned or in the officer scheme does not go on the type 2 form. There's a couple of questions about the calculator now. Just going back to what I said earlier, if you can't add additional rows, that means the macros aren't working. So download it, right click, go into properties, enable macros, and then you'll be able to add in additional rows. And there was another question. When you do the calculator, it works out a annualized income. You don't put that income into the type 2 form, you put your actual income, but the calculator helps you work out what your tier should be. And that's the bit that you need from the calculator. So you're putting in your parts each 6 months, letting it work out your annualized pay, and then the tier. And the tier is the bit of information that needs to go into your type 2 form. That's the crucial element.
I think that's really, really important, isn't it? Because we have seen some people who've already submitted, and no doubt, you know, the problem with the macros on the calculator won't have helped some people anyway. But I think some people have made the assumption that the annualised figure goes in for the 6 months pay. As Christian's pointed out, that whole annualising process is to calculate the correct tier rate for the 6 months of April to September and the 6 months of October to March. But your pay that you've earned is the pay that you've earned. So Hopefully this has been a helpful session. Lots and lots of questions as normal. We've covered a lot of things.